Ladies and gentlemen, every Tuesday, a bunch of sweaty titled players come together online and play an event known as the Title Tuesday Tournament on Chess.com. There are prizes, and it is an 11-round tournament with a 3-minute, 1-second bonus time control. Recently, Chess.com has made it every single week and twice every single Tuesday. It used to be like one Tuesday of the month or maybe 2 Tuesdays of the month. Now it's every Tuesday, and there's double the amounts of events. Now, Hikaru wins like 90% of these tournaments, and Magnus never plays in any of them because he obviously represents a rival chess website. But that all changed a couple of days ago when it was Title Tuesday, and Magnus Carlsen was online. Everybody obviously started clamoring, oh my gosh, it's Magnus. Are we going to see Hikaru versus Magnus? And Hikaru actually did not have a great event. He didn't even finish the event. Well, Magnus won the event. He got 10 points out of 11, winning 9, drawing 2 games, going undefeated, obviously. And in this video, I'm going to show you 5 of his games where he just absolutely just obliterated GMs like it was absolutely nothing. Now, there is a recurring theme in these games. Hopefully you'll be able to identify it. And I'm just going to show you the games. And at the end of the tournament, not only did he win Title Tuesday, he also was number 1 on the website in Blitz, which he also took from Hikaru. Hikaru will probably pass him again, but all right, first game I have for you, Magnus plays the move b3. Magnus at this point is 4.5 out of 5, and there's 6 more rounds to go. He's playing Nikita Meshkovs from Latvia, and Magnus plays a double fianchetto, actually. So he just fianchettos 2 bishops. It's always interesting to see what Magnus is going to do against people who have the same title as him, but are like not close in playing strength. I mean, Magnus is much stronger than a lot of the competition, even though they're both grandmasters. And here we just get we get a totally symmetrical English in the sense of, like, you know, this side of the board. Meshkovs could play the move b6 here and play bishop b7, but instead of that, he plays the move knight c6, and then he plays b6. Now, if Magnus were to play a move like, I don't know, knight c3, then we would actually have total symmetry. But Magnus does not do that. He understands that Meshkovs is about to play bishop b7, so he breaks in the center right away. Black now must really react to this, because if you don't, then you're going to get hit with d5, and then you're just positionally lost because this bishop is bad and this knight gets booted out of the middle, and white just has a lot more space. So we have cd4, knight d4, and now really it's all about this diagonal. This bishop is much more stable than that bishop, and there's pressure here. It's very difficult for black to move. Meshkovs plays rook c8, queen d2, and Magnus now does the dip back. Now that this knight can take, and then this bishop has reinforcement, you move the knight out of the middle, and you prevent black from ever playing the move d5 by rotating this knight and trying to jump into d5 yourself. So in some moments, we are going to get the move knight to e3 after Magnus brings his rooks to the middle. You might ask yourself, why did he do it this way? Why did he not play rook d1 this way? First of all, when Magnus plays moves, you just pay attention. You do not ask questions. And second of all, well, he has to go here because that will open, this will be open, and this is the only open file. It makes a little bit more sense than playing rook ad1, rook fe1, because this rook will get stuck behind the pawn. But you could always push the pawn forward. So now we have h5, and here's knight e3. Now bishop h6 laser beams this bishop. So Meshkovs actually has a very nice bishop here. And Magnus is completely unconcerned. Basically, once this bishop moved to pin the knight to the queen, it abandoned that diagonal, and Magnus immediately pounces upon it. After knight takes d5, we have cd5, and again, we talked about earlier, this pawn, in a slightly different setting, blocks this bishop and kicks this knight out because it can't go anywhere toward the middle. It could go to e5, like it could, and he does that, but now f4 and queen d4, and black is on the verge of mate. Apparently, Stockfish improves on Magnus's play here by playing the move d6, which is a really brutal move. You reopen the bishop, but if bishop takes g2, you have this. So now the pawn is hitting the rook. It's just a really bad problem, and you just obliterate black here. d6 is a really savage move. But Magnus Carlsen, as much as he is a savage, he is not Stockfish. So instead, he plays the more human approach, where his queen and bishop battery are just brutalizing this position. Constant threat of infiltration. E4 is coming potentially, and now he does go ahead and plays this move d6. Meshkovs plays rook c1, and as always, if Magnus ever squanders any bit of his advantage, which computer is trying to say that he might have because he's no longer delivering mate, what Magnus will do now is completely switch gears and play the endgame. Because hidden in this entire position is the fact that at the end of everything, white has a cluster of 4 pawns altogether and 2. Black has these 2 pawns, but this pawn is weak. These pawns are super weak, and white is going to get into c7 and terrorize the 7th rank. And now that is exactly what Magnus does. He just paralyzes black. Meshkov's tries to get a queen's off, but here comes rook c7. And even though for a brief moment Meshkov's is up a pawn, his pieces are super passive. This bishop is still a killer, right? The piece Magnus put on b2 30 moves ago is still a killer, right? Rook c7 comes. This bishop is still here, and I told you Magnus is going to terrorize the 7th rank. Black has to defend perfectly. Magnus avoids an exchange, defends his pawn with his king, and now begins the gobbling process. He wins 3 pawns. He wins all 3 pawns. He wins d6, a7, d7, and we go from 1 pawn down to 2 pawns up, making it look easy. And folks, how do you win this endgame? Like, this endgame looks like white can't make any progress, right? I mean, the king is sort of stuck over here in his little box. The white king can't just, like, begin running this way because all of a sudden I sneak in and I eat all your pawns. Well, Magnus chips away, makes a trade, and then brings the bishop all the way back, stabilizes the center, and now advances his 2-on-1. Now he has a runaway pawn, which he will promptly push to the point of being a decoy. Then he wraps around trading off the bishop. The bishop, of course, really should not trade, so the pawn walks forward again. And here comes e4. And on move 50 of this game, as Magnus overwhelmed the black defenses, the final stage was bringing in his king, as both pawns are basically keeping black's pieces at bay, but you cannot break through unless you bring your king as well. And Meshkov's resigned. Magnus applies pressure throughout the opening, the middle game, transforming the game into a really difficult endgame, and gets a win. His next game, he was playing the undefeated Fier. Fier from Brazil had 6 out of 6. Magnus had 5.5 out of 6. And this time Magnus plays b6 with black. And white plays this bishop d3 setup, very, very flexible. Magnus here, rather than playing for e6 and d5, which is very common, or knight f6, plays d6, knight d7, and takes a completely dark squared approach. So he puts all his pieces on the dark squares. He is not worried that his light squared bishop is locked out of the game. So in all these games, we're going to watch Magnus play a lot of different structures. Last game, we watched him play a structure where it was symmetrical, and then he traded a center pawn, and there was a c pawn for a d pawn missing, and how he kind of wrapped around his knights to together go forward to the d5 square. But in this next game, where he has the black pieces, we're going to watch him navigate a closed structure. So he plays a5, preventing b4 and allowing knight c5. But again, he doesn't have to rush with that. And here he plays a very, very, very interesting plan. He plays bishop e7, and this. What? To the untrained eye, that looks absurd. What's he doing? Well, what he's doing is he wants to remove the dark squared bishop because he has a bunch of pawns on dark squares, right? So by creating a dark squared structure and complex, he removes the dark squared bishop, and now this bishop can always come alive this way, while this one is stuck behind the pawns that white committed to the light squares. Fier's like, no, I want to run away with my bishop. Nope. Knight e7, and Fier advances on the queen side with the move b4. Magnus plays knight g6, brings his queen to e7, and Fier now creates an indication that he would like to play the move f4. And Magnus has to react quite quickly. Because Magnus plays knight f6, if Fier here plays f4, and Magnus isn't quick to react to this, like let's say he plays h6, then here comes f5, here comes knight h8, h3, g4, you know, queen g3, h4, g4, like white just wins by force. The space advantage becomes suffocating. You're choking on smoke at this point. So Magnus needs to deal with this immediately. And that's why Fier plays f3, because Magnus would have gone here. And then he would have played here, and then he would have played, you know, knight g4. Bishop can come back around this way and trade for something defending the white position. So slow playing, right? But Fier still has a great position. Magnus is like, I got to get rid of this knight, which is why I play bishop a6. And rook fc8. And I mean, yeah, Magnus played a slightly dubious opening, and he's slowly being punished for it as Fier is just advancing into his position very, very methodically. So how is Magnus going to deal with the worst position, right? At the end of the day, it takes gutsy play sometimes when you're the GOAT to defend a bad position. So what is Magnus going to do? Well, he starts advancing that side as well. He's going to fight fire with fire. So king h2, here comes h6, knight h5. Magnus is completely unafraid. Moves the pawns up, moves the king up, moves the knight up, and now he chops on b4, he chops on b5, he chops on a2, and he plays rook a8. But the true piece of counterplay here, as white is stuck defending the potential infiltration of the rook, and he does. White does stop the potential infiltration. I mean, you're not going to go rook a3, right? Queen b2 just kicks you back out. What does black do here? It's kind of insane that in this position, after black has suffered for like the majority of 25 moves, black plays g5, and black is better. You know why black is better? Because black is going to take on h4 and plant the knight on f4 permanently. Because this bishop is so bad. And if white takes on g5, as he does in the game, then we have queen g5, and you're going to bring the rook, or you're going to bring the rook this way when white is defending. Suddenly, it's black who has the initiative. And that's exactly what's happening. Every single piece for Magnus has come alive. The rook on the queen side pressuring, every piece on the king side pressuring. But how is Magnus going to break through? In style. Knight f4. A move that looks impossible. But it is because there's queen h4 check. He doesn't even take back right away. And then look at this move. Oh my. He sacrifices a full knight and uses Monster Reborn to bring it back to exactly where it was. Just kidding, that's actually a new knight. And now queen g3 and this, and this, and this, and this if the king goes to the back rank. The pieces swarm, Fear desperately trying to defend the position, but he simply can't, as now Magnus gets his material back and picks up the rook, and Fear resigns. That is insanity. If you go back a little bit, I mean, if anybody had the advantage here, it's Fear. Fear's just got a great position. He's got no problems. How quickly everything goes wrong. One lackadaisical move. Rook a2, unsure of exactly where he's going on the second rank. Magnus swaps off 3 pieces, attacks on the a file, and slams the move g5. And then just in style. It looks like there's no way through. Magnus is like, all right, I'll make a way. Knight f4. That is an incredible idea. And the craziest thing about this position, folks, that bishop on d3 never moved. When it was developed on move 3, it never moved the rest of the game. And when Magnus played this idea of bishop g5, the point was to play against the bishop. What better way to play against the bishop than to trade off your opponent's good bishop? And it literally never moves again. I don't know how Magnus does it. He makes it look completely effortless. Completely effortless. Must be the Magnus effect. I mean, the bishop never moved. It never moved. It just died like 35 moves later. But now, in the next 3 games, Magnus has to play 3,000 rated opponents. What is he going to do against 3,000 rated opponents? Well, he's going to play the same opening. However, we're going to obviously get different structures. In this game, we get a reverse London. Jeffrey Xiong, one of the, best players, period in the world. Obviously not like top 10, but he's 2,700. Now we get a reverse London. So, and Magnus again goes for a double fianchetto and knight d2. And it's a very interesting opening. It's extremely flexible for white. You could play for c4. You could also play for e4. Not right now, because you just lose a pawn. Although you don't, there's actually a lot of tactics here, like to b7. So again, this bishop on g2, this double fianchetto setup is just... I wouldn't recommend beginners play this because it's very difficult to understand the little transformations in the position. But the thing is, you have the Magnus effect. You watch Magnus play it and you're like, I could do that, and then like, no, you can't. Your queen's gone. Like, I don't play double fianchetto either because I just don't understand it. But when Magnus plays it, For example, in this game, Magnus plays one of the most disrespectful maneuvers I've ever seen in my life. Watch what Magnus does here. He plays rook a2, queen a1. What? What is that? What? Huh? Here's the idea, all right? The idea is that actually this is not so stupid. And this queen and bishop, believe it or not, create a really difficult to deal with battery. And white will move the rooks over to the queen side and then push the pawns. That is another part of the game plan. So we have bishop c3 and now we have knight e5. So Magnus plugs the center and Jeffrey chops away at it. So he trades the pieces and then kicks the queen out. And the queen doesn't go back to a1. It just goes to c3. And Jeffrey advances on the queen side with the move b5. Okay? Magnus plays rook c1 because obviously this is about to open, which means that you want to control the c file. And that's exactly what happens. And queen c6. And he's unafraid of rook c8 because he's going to take it. That's the whole point. 2 rooks are better than a queen in a position where they can coordinate and be super powerful together. And in this case, that's exactly what's going to happen. Because black is so passive here, black doesn't really have the time to escape. You're going to go rook a8, rook c8, or just take all the pawns. So that is why Magnus reinforces his queen and then just brings the queen in, because the queen's ready to die, like in Harry Potter, except Harry Potter was ready to die. If that's a spoiler for you, you just got to watch the movies. I don't know what to tell you. So knight f3, bishop g6, and now knight d4. So Magnus is using his advanced queen to do some, some dealings over here. And this rook will come here as well. We're going to get the triple battery, but not yet, because if you play rook c2, you're going to lose this pawn, right? So knight e5. Now the queen slides to c5. And now Magnus trades the knight. And this is just going to be a very slow process of rendering this bishop completely useless. This bishop is useful. It hits this, can also always wrap around that way and hit b5. And these pawns are just delicate. These rooks are stuck playing passively. Is the position objectively equal? Of course. But Magnus doesn't care about that. Magnus operates on an entirely different playing field when it comes to evaluation. So he slides the queen over, and now the double battery is coming. And I just love that when on move 11, Magnus played rook a2, it turns out to be absolutely genius. And then he plays rook ac2 a little bit later in the game. And then he slides the queen over, and then his rooks are going to get in. And then he also tries to trade queens. The fact that Magnus here plays queen f4, and it's the top engine move. Like, this is the top, like, Stockfish wants queen f4. If I gave this position to, like, 100 people between the rating of 2,000 and 2,400, I don't know how many of them would play queen f4. I really don't. It's just so cerebral to understand that you can back out of the opponent's position to trade the queen because you control the only open file, which is a major advantage. And then you would render this piece useless, slowly improve your position, and then get in and take. I mean, he's just so good. He's so good. He plays, and you see what he's doing? See what he's doing? He's forcing Jeffrey to play pawn moves of his own, and then he plays rook c7. He doesn't take the rook. He's like, we're trading only on my terms, Jeffrey. Now I'm still going to trade queens with you, just like in the game against Meshkov's. Just like in that game. It's a rook and bishop endgame, and black has no play at all. This is not a position you want to defend against Magnus. This is maybe a position that Jeffrey would defend against me, but not against Magnus. All right? So queen f6, queen b2, Magnus still offering a queen trade, but sometimes it's not about exchanges. Games take a violent end. Magnus gets in, plays queen c6, and the idea is no longer winning the endgame. The idea is now getting to that king. That king is totally boxed in. There is just absolutely no way to defend mate, and that's exactly what ends up happening. Jeffrey kind of tries to make a run for it, and he loses because of queen e8, but Magnus actually misses mate in 3 here. He misses queen c1, which is kind of a funny, you just basically keep going this way, and instead of queen e8, queen, I think you also had like 3 seconds on the clock. It's just mate. You just can't, king h5, queen g5. So, but queen e8 is also very, very much winning, and Jeffrey resigns. So sometimes you use the threat of a depressing endgame to force your opponent to create weaknesses, and that rook made 1 move. It took Jeffrey 36 moves to move that rook. It's just incredible how Magnus is able to make his opponent's pieces completely obsolete. Just, he makes his opponent's pieces not participate in the game. I mean, it's 30-51 is Jeffrey's rating, and he was never in this game. Never. All right, next opponent is Grigory Aparin. He played in the Grand Prix. Magnus now has the black pieces. It's going to be a shocking opening, but this time it's a Catalan by white. So let's see what Magnus does against the Catalan. Well, he does a double fianchetto as well, this time with knight f6, and then knight e4. The point is to trade the knight off and plug the center and make it difficult for white to develop. Magnus grabs the bishop, so he gets the bishop pair, and plays d6 and knight d7. And this time, not like he did against Fier. If you remember against Fier, he played the move e5. This time he plays c5. Now that's interesting. If I'm looking at this, I'm like, wow, why did he go c5 and not e5? What's the major difference? He goes c5 because he wants to open up this bishop. He doesn't go e5 because if Aparin had taken this bishop, well, first of all, the knight is hanging, but let's just say like knight takes e5. The bishop will probably get blocked out of the game because first of all, it can become a target for an attack. And second of all, if you do this, then why is this here? right? Like that's not any good. So he goes c5 and then takes and plays a6. The most insane thing is black is better here. Like literally, black is minus 0.2, 0.3, according to the machine. Why? Because white has nothing. White cannot move anything forward. Every single square in the black position is covered. Every single one. Every single square is covered. The entire fifth rank is protected by something. So what is white gonna do? This is where people falter. So rook d2, kind of like, you know, I'm gonna double up my rooks, just slowly improve. Queen c7, targeting c4, rook to ac8, and I wanna go b5. That's what I want right now. So he plays rook fd1. Now you can't rush with this move, because believe it or not, obviously this is the point, because white can sack. And the problem here for Magnus would be he would lose 3 pawns. He would lose 3 pawns for the knight, and his position would fall apart, and white's structure stays totally intact. Magnus, of course, doesn't blunder that and plays queen c5. And retreats, and he's like, all right, if he goes back to c3, I'll have to figure out something else, but Biden goes for h4. And h5. So Biden is trying to wreck Magnus's kingside structure. We've already seen Magnus deal with some adversity earlier in this video. He plays knight f6, he fights fire with fire, and then here he calls up Biden's bluff. He takes the pawn. I mean, you go to sack a pawn, right? You're sacrificing a pawn so that Magnus opens up his king, and maybe you have queen g5 and bishop f3 to win it back, but the point is Magnus is like, okay, do your worst. Thank you for the pawn, now what? Biden's like, that's a good point. Knight e2, I'm gonna go win the pawn. Boom. b5. Uh-oh. Now you're playing on my terms. You're playing on my pace of the game. You can bring the knight to b6. That's great. Where's it going? Now your knight is in jail. You made one attacking move. And by the way, are you still going to go win that pawn? Is that still part of the game plan? Oh, you're going to attack my queen? All right, I'm going queen e7. Now what? Oh, you're taking the open file? Yeah, remember this pawn that you gave me so graciously? Well, you could have it back. If you don't take it, I'm going to either push or take you. So I'm just going to keep opening your king side, right? If you take it, then I have this. Kabam. So now your pawn is a target for my queen. And also, when everything settles, I'm going to win this knight. And then this pawn is a loner pawn. That pawn is a loner pawn. I am going to go attack your king. So Magnus uses what he got as a counter offering. Biden comes in with his rook. And doesn't take. He doesn't take the pawn. He lets Magnus has the h-pawn. Oops. Oops. The bishop ties with the queen. And now this. And you cannot play g5 because queen g7. And there's a pin. Every piece of forward momentum that Biden used on Magnus, Magnus immediately turned back. Wins g5. Wins c1. And now slides the king on over. Because it's not the black king who is weak, it is the white king who is weak. And now Magnus will proceed to slowly but surely rip it all apart. Queen g5. Look at this, doesn't even take the knight. Because it's trapped. Doesn't even take it. Like, you could go knight d7 here. It's still trapped. You could go back, elbow d5, etc. All right, so rook d6, and Magnus just advances. And yeah, I mean, rook d5, queen f4, and Biden resigns on move 46. What can I say? You know, we go from this position to Magnus chopping at the center to open up his dark squared bishop, controlling all the forward movement of his opponent. And the second that Biden is like getting feisty with h4, h5, Magnus is like, thanks. And within 5 to 6 moves has a completely winning position. And within 7 to 8 moves is literally winning material in the game. All it took was Biden to like throw one punch. And Magnus is like, wow, really? And that was it. That was just the end. Immediately the end. Crazy. Now, perhaps the toughest test. Round 10, Magnus is playing Parham. Parham Maksudlu constantly at the top of the charts of these events. And check this out. This might look kind of familiar, right? We had something very similar. We had a d3, knight d2, g3, bishop g2. Very similar. This is a Jeffrey Jean game. But obviously a slight difference because Parham plays knight d7, queen c7. He kind of plays in a weird queenside developing way, and e5. So Zhang did not do this. Zhang played, and this is the thing, like, you could play b3, bishop b2, but you're going to get different structures and complexes the whole time. So if you haven't learned anything yet in this video, one of these two moves is going to happen, right? Magnus chooses to play for c4, and then after d4, which is very different than what we've seen so far, chops at the center with the move e3. We have de3, and now he cannot do this, because first of all, this would be lost, and second of all, you would keep all your pieces passive. Knight g4, and Magnus is trying to go for this structure. And he plays the move h3. And my man Parham sacks the knight. He does not go back. He sacks the knight to weaken Magnus's king and just hunt him with knight c5. Knight d3 looks real juicy. If you take on e5, defending the d3 pawn from the knight, then the very simple f6. And yeah, the knight's getting in, and then it's going to fork the house. So how is Magnus going to defend? Passively. He has to play bishop f1 so that knight takes d3, bishop takes d3, right? So bishop takes d3. Now you can't take because the knight takes, so bishop takes e5. And sliding the king out of the way. Once you get the king out of the way of the fork, rook d8, bishop back to d4, and king h2. Magnus just walks the king very delicately over and then is like, yo, Parham, what are you doing, bro? I got 4 pieces. What you doing here? I don't, you know. And Parham obviously is still trying to fire things off at the king side, but he just doesn't have enough. He truly doesn't have enough. And Magnus liquidates, continues to deal with this forward aggression by just defending. Just cool, calm, and collected, stubborn defense. Now, you might look at this position and go, oh my God, Magnus is up a piece. Why isn't Parham resigning? You try to defend this. You try to defend this position with white. I'm telling you, it's not so simple. It's very easy when you trust Magnus to do it, but this is a tough position. You know, Magnus can maybe not mess this up, but trust me, another human very well might be able to. I mean, like, look how passive white is. So how is white going to unwind? Well, he's going to transfer his knight to g5. Notice how black played one pawn move to defend his bishop, and now Magnus is like, oh, that square looks good. Boop, boop, boop. Now the knight is good. It constantly doesn't let the black king escape. And that's it. Magnus just turns the tables now, forks this, trades, and the knight goes galloping back into the black position. Check, check, picks up b7. And the game is over. Parham gets a little bit too aggressive. We kind of, this was obviously the shortest game of the video, but it was an example of how to deal with, you know, sometimes on move 15, your opponent just doesn't really want to play a game anymore. They just want to, you know, take your head off completely. Just stay cool, all right? Defend against the threats, and sometimes the ugly moves are necessary, like king g2, like king h2. Just walk the king completely out of the way, and now that the king is safe, you deal with your opponent's threats. If the opponent is actually making threats, you deal with them by trading, by making sure there's no, you know, there's no forks, there's no attacks, there's no captures. For example, here, if bishop takes f6, there might have been this move. Uh-oh. If you take the rook, you lose your queen. But if you take the queen, it's check. And then you lose the piece you're up. So it's so easy to throw this game. And that's what Parham was kind of hoping for. Magnus just outcalculates, very cold-blooded, and just gets the win. And Magnus ended up drawing the last game of the tournament versus Vladimir Filisev. But he ended with a 33-55 performance. That is the rating that you saw in the thumbnail, 33-55. That was his performance rating for the event. And he gained, like, I don't know, 50, 60 points. And he ended the tournament as the highest rated player on chess.com, which Hikaru will most likely go back on the grind and try to surpass. But man, Magnus shows up, wins a title Tuesday for the first time, and plays a title Tuesday for the first time in years, wins it convincingly, doesn't elaborate, leaves, doesn't play the second one, doesn't even say anything about it. It just must be so interesting being Magnus Carlsen. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one. Get out of here.